Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to a special edition of the 21047.com podcast. This is a special edition because it's just me today. There's no interview, it's just me recapping for you my Georgia Jewel journey. And I call it a journey because last weekend was the race, one weekend ago today this Sunday. I was driving home from Georgia, reflecting on the entire Georgia Jewel experience, which took in much more than race day, September 22nd. This race became much more than just going out and tackling this 35-mile Georgia Jewel trail race. It was an experience really that lasted over the course of the better part of this year, really, when I look back on it and I started thinking about it driving home. And that often tends to be the case with me, and running these individual races become a much bigger story. I think I do that on purpose. In fact, I know I do it on purpose. I'm not the best runner in the world. I'm not going to be winning any races, and that's fine. I long ago became okay with that. And I became okay with it because, like I said, more often than not, these races I run have a deeper background story to them, and many times these background stories are a bigger part of the story than the actual running. And that certainly was the case with the Georgia Jewel. I would say this experience started even back in January of this year when I went to Houston, made an attempt to run a 6 hour marathon, which I had never done before. And after Houston, I still had not done before because I came up short at mile 18 on that race. I got pulled off the course because I couldn't keep up with the mandatory cutoff times at the different intervals along the course. So at mile 18, I couldn't keep up and got a bus ride back to the finish line, which I had a lot of friends down there that came down to support everything we were trying to do for the Hurricane Harvey victims. Again, even that race had a much bigger story in the background. So to have a lot of friends there to come up short was a bit of a defeat for me. And that sparked in me some changes in my running attitude, mainly that I just recommitted to the running aspect of it. I always was good at finding the stories to run for, but maybe not putting in the work to run up to the level of that story. So I just wanted to be running better. And so I started cranking out more miles and became a little more planful about those miles. It's a long running joke with folks who know me, maybe folks who listen to this show, the quote unquote Cartwright plan, which really is symbolic of no plan at all. It's sort of the wing it plan. Just kind of run when you feel like it, run how you feel like it, eat how you feel like it. Everything just kind of is a spontaneous go with the flow sort of running plan, which for me always worked out really well because it didn't put more pressure on me than I wanted. It didn't, the plan itself didn't make running miserable, which plans can often do sometimes, but failing was miserable too. So I had to kind of weigh, do I want to get more planful about this and maybe prevent a Houston in the future, or do I just want to keep going with the Cartwright plan, lots of coffee nut M&Ms, and winging it when it came to running? My choice was I decided to start putting in more miles, be a little more planful about it, incorporating some different training into that, including, some speed work, different interval work, different cardio pieces that I had been leaving out before, I guess a little cross training. So I think that looking back, the whole Houston thing really spurred a different attitude in me. At the same time, if you're listening to this, I've been doing this podcasting journey for the better part of the last 18 months, I guess. I've had the chance to interview some really cool and some really inspiring people. And so in the aftermath of Houston, I through a lot of story, I ended up signing up and headed to Little Rock, Arkansas to run the marathon there in Arkansas. and had some friends headed down there. Nicole Williams, Tracy Outlaw, Ashley, Anthony, my buddy Anthony was going to be down there, and just so a lot of support, lots of folks around that race, and it became sort of an unplanned redemption race from that Houston Marathon. Leading up to that race, I had interviewed some really interesting people. JP Cottle was one of them, Dave Jones, the Eternal Endurance guy. Both of these guys had run some really crazy running challenges. JP had run the World Marathon Challenge, 7 marathons in 7 days on 7 different continents, and just interviewing him, talking to him about his story, just the logistics of that, let alone running 7 marathons in 7 days, but just the logistics of flying all around the world from spot to spot, trying to factor in the nutrition piece of that and the travel, the sleep. I was just floored by that accomplishment. And then Dave Jones, Eternal Endurance guy, did 52 marathons in a year, all of his in the United States and all continents on Earth. So these guys really had got me thinking on a whole different level about running, just talking to them and how their mind worked, how their mind was always drifting towards this next challenge, how they were always, and Dave Jones said it, daring greatly. That was sort of his mantra in that interview that I came away with. Also, in this time, I had interviewed who has now become a really dear friend of mine, Jenny Baker. I had been connected with Jenny after some online conversation, really online reading. Harvey Lewis, who a lot of you know, did a series last November around vegan, vegetarian eaters, is actually around Thanksgiving week, when I myself was not a vegan eater around Thanksgiving time. But I got to reading some of these stories. One of these young ladies he highlighted in his series was Jenny Baker. And a couple of things stuck out about Jenny. It wasn't the nutrition angle that Harvey was approaching this with. It was she had started this running group at a church in Cincinnati, and it had gathered a huge following. And so I was really curious about that. And then she was also writing a book, and I think at this time actually the book had just come out, The War on Normal, and it was just sort of about these societal pressures that come on women to what their bodies should look like, and post baby birth kind of fighting to fight off those cultural expectations and wanting to get that old body back. And I'm not a woman, I've never been pregnant, I've never been post birth, but just sort of this idea of what goes into that. I think there was a lot of parallel with it in this running journey of comparing ourselves to others, and some of the expectations that come with our running that maybe force us to put some pressure on ourselves that's unnecessary. And sometimes the answer to that is just changing our perspective and how we look at those things. So I did an interview with Jenny Baker. All of these interviews were about at the same time. Jenny, which really didn't become a huge part of our conversation, but Jenny Baker is the race director of a race called the Georgia Jewel. And I guess somehow that got logged in the back of my mind when I did this interview. I did not interview her to talk about the Georgia Jewel, and we didn't talk about the Georgia Jewel much, but we talked about it enough that it planted a crazy seed in my mind. And so at Little Rock, when I got around my friends, and especially my friend Nicole, there began a lot of joking about Dare Greatly. And so I started joking. I think my next challenge will be 7 marathons in 7 days. And I wanted to take something on big like JP Cottle or Dave Jones. And my mantra for the weekend, I began talking a lot about daring greatly. And so we started joking about these big race events that we could take on. And I ended up completing the Little Rock Marathon. I did get my redemption. Very, very slow and painful redemption. But I think all of this was sort of a perfect storm. Started talking about daring greatly. I'd interviewed all these really fascinating people. And, that's a cool thing about this running community when other people are out there daring greatly and conquering some incredible races and some incredible adventures. It does plant these seeds in our mind. It does make us wonder. And for me, it's not, I don't want to be J.B. Cottle and I don't want to be Jenny Baker or Dave Jones, but I do want to think like them. I want to be inspired by their thought process, not necessarily their thoughts, but just the way they think, the way that they dream. And so when I crossed that Little Rock Marathon finish line and sort of exorcise this demon from Houston in a small way, although I'm headed back to Houston in January, I do have unfinished business there. But when you cross these finish lines and accomplish something tough, you do start to think, I can dream bigger. You get this confidence boost. It's almost, this euphoria of success races through you and makes you start believing that it's not a joke to go out and think about running 7 marathons in 7 days or being on 7 continents in 7 days running a marathon or writing a book like Jenny Baker did, which I love writing. So just this idea that she had written and published this book was a dream big sort of deal for me. When you experience success in your life at these big goals like Little Rock, it fuels this sort of dreaming you have going on in yourself. And somewhere along in there, then, as I was dreaming and processing a lot of this with my friend Nicole, the Georgia Jewel race came out of our mouths. It sort of suddenly got linked with this joking about Dare Greatly, and then here's this conversation with Georgia Jewel race director Jenny Baker. And then somehow those things got married into like a real idea. It was no longer a joke. It was no longer a mantra of Dare Greatly. It was suddenly an idea. And shortly after that, as I was communicating and chatting back and forth with my friend Nicole, it was a Saturday morning. I remember the chair I was sitting in. I remember the phone that I was holding. I remember the email that came up that included her registration, her confirmation registration to the Georgia Jewel 35-mile race in September. And suddenly, this Dare Greatly dream, Dare Greatly Little Rock, Arkansas joke was a friend of mine registered in response to all of that to really go run a real 35-mile race, much, much further than I had ever run. And, I'm a victim of peer pressure. I can't ignore it, especially when it comes with daring me to do greatly. And so a few minutes later, I too was registered to run the Georgia Jewel race. And so that a journey began. I was pointed towards, along with Nicole, to run the Georgia Jewel. So I started training for this race. Fortunately, I was already on a roll of running more miles every month than I'd ever run. I was routinely running. I was on a streak, actually, of running 100 miles a month, which was much further than I'd ever consistently run. And so I kept that up. Actually, in May and June of this year, I think I ran almost 300 miles combined. At the same time, and all of this stuff, you see, when you start looking back, like I did Sunday driving home, and you start looking back, which I'm prone to do. I don't like stories to end. I don't like them to end, period. That's part of it. But I don't like them to end either without really looking back and starting to reflect on all the pieces of a story that made it what it is. And part of this Georgia Jewel journey was brought to life by Harvey Lewis this summer. My buddy Harvey went out and attempted to run the Appalachian Trail faster than any man had ever run it. Fastest time known to man is what they called it. Harvey was attempting to run the Appalachian Trail, I think in, I don't know, 48 days, somewhere around there. And so I had a chance, and told this story in some great detail earlier in the year, but I had a chance to go over and meet Harvey on the Appalachian Trail as he came into Virginia from Tennessee, I believe it was. And that was a really cool experience to be out there. It was my first time really on a trail as technical as the Appalachian Trail, which I would later discover is very similar to the technical aspects of the Pinoti Trail in Georgia, which is part of the Georgia Jewel race. And being out there running up this mountain and really experiencing just how difficult this whole trail running deal was going to be, but at the same time, seeing Harvey take on something as big as anybody in ultra running and trail running can take on, to say, I want to cover this Appalachian Trail, which thousands have done, and do it faster than anybody ever has. I mean, that's as dream and dare greatly as one can dare. And being in the midst of that, so I'm standing at the top of this mountain at the border of Tennessee and Virginia on the Appalachian Trail, and here comes Harvey Lewis after. And then that story was a long day, right? I got lost. I ended up running 21 miles when my plan was to do about 5. It was a challenging day to get there. I ran into one of Harvey's friends, and actually a young lady that he coaches, Melanie, who was preparing at that time to run the Badwater. So I got to hear some of her experience training for that and her own Dare Greatly opportunity. And so going up to this spot with her and chatting, watching Harvey Lewis come flying out of Tennessee on this trail into Virginia, basically gave us a high five and a hug, and then he was gone. And his gone was that he was just on such a mission to accomplish this goal. And I think when we surround ourselves, or when we go out of our way to enter into lives of people who are taking on things bigger than themselves, and Harvey's an accomplished runner, but this was bigger than him, but that's why he was there. He was there to be a part of something bigger than him, to challenge himself. And so for me to be in the middle of that, even for just the few minutes that I was, it fueled this commitment I had to tackling this Georgia Jewel experience. So it was really a summer of just these perfect storm moments. But I think we have to stop and pause, and in the midst of this perfect storm, take note of these things that are happening in our lives. Going to see Harvey was not a plan of mine. It really came together very spontaneously. I just happened to be in that part of the state. I had been following my good buddy Tracy Outlaw and his storytelling of Harvey's journey, and it came to me, wait a minute, I'm over here where this guy's chasing history, and we're all, part of history one way or another, so it's, don't want to overblow the historic impact of this on everybody, but to me, it was a big historical moment, and I wanted to be a part of it. And so I think, sometimes we just enter into those moments or experience them without really stopping for a moment and reflecting on, what does this mean? And where does this fit into my journey? How can I draw on this piece of a story in my life? And really connecting all these individual stories together the best we can, because I personally believe that they're being weaved into our lives for a meaning, for purpose, and I think that purpose is to guide us onto our next day and onto our next opportunity. And so that was powerful, and I just had all of these things sort of coming together this summer in a meaningful way, and they were all part of this Georgia Jewel journey. Then later, I guess it was in July, and my friend Nicole, who we suddenly were Georgia Jewel teammates, this just kind of became our deal that we were going to tackle together. She was in July, here in Central Virginia in July, visiting with family. And we went out on a long training run on the Capitol Trail. Actually, I think we did 16 miles that day. It was a long, hot, actually sort of rainy day. But in the midst of that long run that day, I got attacked, viciously attacked by some yellow flies. And, they were routine bites to me at that point. Annoying, aggravating, itchy, scratchy. It was just another bite. Unfortunately, I discovered later the next week one of those bites had got infected, turned into a really long health struggle story. The short end of that story is the bite got infected. I got really just sick and down. I went to visit the doctor 3 times, I think, over the course of 10 days. I didn't run. I was really honestly starting to get depressed because I couldn't run. I think a lot of that was I'd been on such a training roll pointing towards Georgia Jewel that I just had some momentum. And then this whole event threw that momentum out of whack a bit. Physically, number one, when you don't run for 10 days, you lose some of what you had gained in the training. I didn't feel well, so it takes a while to recover from an infection, which it eventually went away, and I started to recover the way I wanted to recover. But then also, I had been pointing towards the Georgia Jewel practice run, which was taking place in August. And really had been hoping to be in great shape to go down and experience my first experience with the Pinhoti Trail on the Georgia Jewel Trail race, part of the race. It was going to be my first opportunity to really experience what I was going to be experiencing in September when I did the 35-mile race. So I went down there and did this practice run. Nicole actually went down there too. We did this thing together. I wasn't at the full strength that I wanted to be at, and I didn't do well on that practice run. It was a long day, but I started to learn. I think what I took away from that whole bug bite thing and this practice run is that confidence is pretty easy when momentum is on our side. And I'm not, you gotta work hard to get this momentum going your way. You just can't sit back and say, hey, here, momentum, come get on my side. You have to work hard. You have to train hard to get the momentum going. But once it goes, it's pretty easy to fall into that flow. But you know what is really, really hard is getting the momentum back once you lose it. What is really hard is overcoming doubt once that starts to creep into your mind. And, it was just as all of this was a beautiful, perfect storm leading to Georgia Jewel. It was a perfect storm of negativity when the whole bug bite things crept in and impacted my training. And then about the same time, go down to Georgia Jewel. And so the practice run was about 17-ish miles. We ended up completing about 15 and a half. I couldn't do anything more than walk about the last 10 of that. I got really dehydrated early, lost all my strength, and without strength was tackling some of the biggest climbs I had ever climbed. Certainly trails, the nature of which I have never taken on. Very rocky, very narrow, roots. I was tripping, twisting ankles a lot. It was a whole new ball game, and I left Georgia really wondering what I got myself into. Right? I was wondering how on earth, when you struggle through 15 and a half miles and 3 weeks later, which is we were down there 3 weeks before the actual race, you logically start to wonder, where am I getting another 20 miles? There's no way on earth I could have got 20 that day. And, the couple of things I took away from that practice run, I definitely took away doubt. right? I came home with a lot of doubt. When you drive home from Georgia, which is about an 8 hour drive, you experienced a practice run like I did. You spend a lot of time trying to figure out how I can do something that really seems impossible. And what that naturally sort of brings out is doubt. And like I said, momentum is easy to ride with. Overcoming when the momentum goes away and sort of jump starting this attitude that was really full steam ahead towards the finish line. Now it is just stumbling and falling all over the place on the way to the finish line. And, you really have to work hard with your mind to get confidence back. It's not just going to come back to you. And so I had to really start thinking about how I was going to get that momentum back. One way was, and I credit, Jenny spent some time chatting with us after I struggled through that practice run. And, one thing she said to me that I really took to heart was that, hey, Keith, the miles aren't nearly as important now as go home and spend some time. She told me to go to a gym and find a Stairmaster. Now, and her point was it's the climbs that you have to get down. You have to, there's a skill set to this running, which I'd largely ignored over the years. The only skill I really had was just go out, run, right? Get up today, run. Even in the spontaneity of my planning, I already said that I wasn't a big planner, but I did run a lot. But I didn't think much outside of put shoes on, hit road, run. And, for me, that always worked. But now this Georgia Jewel was making me actually not only be more planful about, being structured with when I run and how far I run, but also there's a new technical skills, and climbing was one of them. And being in tune with my heart rate, because, in those climbs and as the heart rate started to race, it was just drawing on so much energy in my body. And I sweat more than the average human being, I think. I just would hate to think anybody sweats more than me, which really drains my body of all the nutrients. And literally, I've experienced it many times running in the summer. And I certainly experienced it that day on the practice run. There is no warning, right? There's no loud beep, beep, beep warning sign that goes off that says, Keith, refuel yourself. You need something, or else here in a half hour or so, you're going to crash. For me, it's just beep, crash. It just happens all of a sudden, and there's no getting it back. And so I left Georgia with a couple of things in mind. I knew I had to follow Jenny's advice and work on these climbs. I did not find a Stairmaster, but I found at our local park, we have an amphitheater that's down, sort of sunken in, and there's a large set of stairs that climbs up out of there. So I spent a lot of time over there running up and down, literally thousands of steps. I remember the first day I went through that routine, I couldn't walk for a week. My calves were so sore. I'd never been so sore from a running event ever, or practice, or just being out. It was painful, but it got better as I, over the next few weeks, continued to run those steps. So that was one thing I did. I also experimented with different sport drinks. Jenny insinuated the Gatorade was not going to work for me. It wasn't going to get it done. I needed to find something that nutritionally would give me the calories I needed, would keep me hydrated and get the electrolytes in me, the replacements that I needed. So I settled on a sports drink. I went with the Morton's, it's sort of a new drink, and Nicole had been using it. And so I tried it on several long runs at home, and it seemed to be working. So this post sort of 3 weeks leading up to the Georgia Jewel race itself, I, spent some time working on the skill set, practicing actually the things I thought would prepare me to be more successful at the actual Georgia Jewel run itself than I had been at the practice run. And, in terms of that momentum, I really started feeling like I was getting some of it back when you started addressing the areas, and that was the beauty of that run. I told folks, yes, the bad part was I went down and experienced firsthand just how hard this challenge was that I had taken on. This whole Dare Greatly joke turned into a real life goal, and sort of a dream was now real. It was real in every aspect because I was signed up to do it, and I now knew exactly what that course was going to be like. I was going to run, and I knew I, I didn't know how greatly I had dared. When I went and ran it, the practice run, this was like dare, 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 greatly, greatly, greatly. It was magnified. The magnitude of this was magnified many times over, and I didn't know. I didn't know what I'd taken on. Now I did. And so that was one piece of it. By going down there, running this practice run, I now knew what I was into. And in many ways, that wasn't good because it did nothing to bolster my confidence. But then on the other hand, and I think on a much more important hand, I knew what I needed to work on. I knew what I needed to come home and do. A lot of that was thanks to Jenny for really giving me some instruction. I had met some great folks along the way, had some long conversations with my buddy Gregory Byerline, who I interviewed on this podcast, and met him online. He had been real helpful in my preparation, and but I knew what I needed to address, right? And I think we're lucky sometimes if we know that. If you are headed towards a goal and you've got these sort of weaknesses in your ability to do that, these inadequacies or incompetencies, but you know them and you know how to address them, that's really a gift. That's a benefit. That gives you your best chance at being successful on the goal. So when I left that practice run, yep, there was a little bit of a lack of confidence, which I had already been on that roll headed into the practice run. I had gone from this great momentum to doubt. The practice run itself left me with nothing but more doubt, but like I said, it let me know what I needed to work on, and in working on those things, in running those steps, in experimenting with the different drinks and finding something I really believed was going to work, the confidence was coming back. And I really felt good running into Georgia Jewel race day. Headed into that weekend, there was a fair amount of doubt that just comes with anytime you take on something you've never taken on before. There's doubt there. Nobody, if it was taking on something bigger than I've ever done, but knowing full well I can do it, well, the daring really isn't so daring, right? It's in taking on something that inherently comes with a lot of doubt that makes it exciting. It makes it part of a bigger story, and that's certainly what Georgia Jewel was. So last week, then, I headed down. Race day itself was upon us. This 5-month journey that I had been on was finally here. This idea of a spark, of a whisper of Dare Greatly, dream was now really coming to the closing chapter. And unfortunately, that closing chapter was, let's go run 35 miles on the Pinhoti Trail. So, race morning, I'll just fast forward ahead. Race morning, we meet at the Dalton Convention Center. The forecast all along was for a very hot day. I started monitoring the forecast 2 weeks in advance. Two big H words were there every single step leading to the way: hot and humid. And so the forecast ranged anywhere from upper 80s to low 90s, dew points in the upper 60s to low 70s, which for me historically has been a worst case scenario of all worst case scenarios. That just is, it undoes me, right? It just is my undoing when I get out there and try to run in those conditions. But we got up race morning, and the temperatures really, there was a little cool in the air even, jackets. There were people running around with jackets. I saw the forecast. I knew it was short-lived, but in stepping out that morning and feeling that, it didn't have that drain on me that many races do when you start in the soupy, hot, and humid. So mentally, I was still doing great. I mean, I was confident. I really felt like this was going to go well. And I thought if I got enough miles under my belt in the cool of the morning, it was about, race start time was 7 a.m. And I really felt like that was going to work well for me. Starting the day with some good temperatures was going to be good. So we loaded on all these buses that hauled us to the start line. It's a little bit intimidating when you get on a bus and you're taking a 45-minute drive up winding mountains and in and out of these different roads. And the whole time I'm thinking, I got to run back. We were leaving the finish line, driving to the starting, and you're on this bus that's really, some scene in a movie. Like you're being kidnapped, hauled out into the middle of some unknown place, and then, hey, go find your way home. And on the way over, a buddy of mine, Aaron, who's a friend I've met online now, we were sitting and he was behind us. And this was I believe his third time tackling this race. He did not finished it. The previous couple of times he had attempted it. And he was sharing his experiences with us. He lived local there, so he had run every section of this trail many times. It was not helping me. Listen to Aaron describe some of this. But what was helping me was he really had the spirit of, I'm getting it done today. He was talking the official cutoff time for this 35-mile race was 12 hours, which was my goal. I wanted to be done in 12 hours. Aaron was talking about finishing up in 14 hours. He was very fine with that. He had light. He had everything he needed to be out there. And I thought, that's really a very strong attitude to be fully prepared to be out there for 14 hours doing whatever he needed to do to pull it off. And so on one hand, again, as he described the challenge of it all that we were about to take on, that was feeding into doubt. But hearing his commitment, and here's a guy who had failed at it twice, hearing his commitment to get it done this time, to be willing to do whatever he needed to do to get it done, that helped me. So here we were at this large congregation. The bus finally stopped. It was like, all right, y'all, get ready, go find your way home. It was really cool to be able to spend some time at that start line, mingling with folks who I'd met online, which is always part of this story. And I encourage us all, as we sign up for these races, go online, find people who are running these races with you, maybe perfect strangers. I have met some incredible people the last 5 months who really define this journey much more than the outcome of this race I'll talk about in a little bit. Gregory Byerline is one of them. Like I said, I got to interview him. We've shared this faith connection, this sort of older dad connection. He's become a really good friend. I got to meet him at the starting line and chat. That is a beautiful part of the day, that start line, those conversations that are never going to leave me. And just meeting so many other people in person that I'd met in this online community. It was invigorating to see everybody there gathered together. When you're standing with people who are getting ready to take on 35 miles, and then also the 50-milers were there. These are some unique people, right? They're getting ready to take on this huge challenge together, leaning into each other for support. Looking around, it was just easy to be inspired. You knew they all had these stories like I had in getting there, and I'm a story curious guy. I just couldn't help but wonder, what are their stories? I just knew they were all cool. They all had some beauty behind them, like I really felt like mine did. And so that was a great way to start. We actually took off, we got to start, and so it was the four of us. It was Nicole and myself and Andy and Lori, who are local here in Richmond. We all sort of took off together, and then Andy and Lori got ahead of us a little bit, and we settled in for, I don't know, maybe a mile or so with a couple of gentlemen that were running together. They were brothers, and so they were talking about they had done the practice run, and here they were back entering their own race, and just chatting with them a little bit about how committed they were to get this thing done. They were doing the 35 mile too. It was a great way to just start with. I guess I would just say this is such a cool community. The trail runners, different. They're not better, not worse than the rest of the running community. It's just got a unique sort of dynamic to it that I really enjoyed. I just really enjoyed these people. I've always enjoyed this running community. I tell anybody that's why I'm here, whether it's the marathon community, the half marathon community, the 5K community. It's these friendships, relationships, this sense of belonging you get. But in this day, when I really needed it, when I knew I was taking on something much bigger than I ever had, I think it was just the timing of this trail runner community, their willingness to take some pride in that. It wasn't an exclusive sort of attitude. They were anxious to have other people join their sort of group of ultra runners. They were happy to see people discovering what they had discovered on the trails. I felt really accepted, and so I think that was the unique piece of this community, was just the timing of it, the right people at the right time in my life. And so off we went, right? We were underway, headed back to the finish line, find your way home. Well, we were in the finding piece. And the first thing that really stuck out to me was just the beauty of this. The first couple of miles were like a flat service road, and I knew this. I had studied this trail. I knew not to be lulled into thinking, oh, this is just going to be a flat service road all day. This service road dumped us into the Pinhoti Trail, this beautiful wilderness, the climbs. The early part of this race, the first 10 miles or so, I was just taken by what everybody told me I'd be taken by. Just this creation, just this sense of God's beauty speaking to me in a way that maybe I wouldn't experience other places. I've said all along, running has really become my quiet place, and in so it's given me an opportunity to really talk to God and listen to him in a way that I hadn't done very good in the past. And having his creation talk to me out there was a whole new way to listen to him. Maybe listen with sort of a pop-out book sort of way. You know, you open these books and you read the words, but then this beauty just pops out of the book at you. And it just magnifies the words. It just magnifies what you're hearing. And so God was really speaking to me pretty strong out there this morning in those early miles, just the overlooks into the valleys, these sort of caves and rock formations, the waterfalls. I had my phone out constantly, just snapping pictures, just snapping. I was caught up in the experience, and running wise, I was feeling great, right? I was nutritioning according to my plan, had the drink that I had found successful. I had mapped out a plan. My friends made fun of me, but I had an Excel spreadsheet with me that projected out mile per mile how I wanted to run this race. I had found a man who ran this race last year in 7.5 hours and just projected his mile times out. What would that look like divided up in a 12-hour race? Did a lot of calculations around this. Nicole said, that's really, really a nerdy thing you've done. And I said, I own it. I'll own it. It is a nerdy thing to do, but I knew that I had to have a plan. I had to have something to guide me through these 35 miles. I went on the practice run. I went with feel, just kind of go and monitor how you're feeling, go fast, slow down, speed up based on feel. And that wasn't going to work. I knew that I needed to have sort of the times mapped out for me to at least be a gauge for where I was in pulling this thing off. I had one goal: finish this thing in 12 hours. I had a plan in my hand, tucked into a little waterproof baggie that for 35 miles told me where I needed to be. And so through the first 10 miles, feeling good, taking in the beauty of this, and I was on pace with my nerdy Excel spreadsheet. So I was feeling really good. But then it was about this mile 10. It was about this mile 10 when it was like somebody, it was like they might as well just stood in front of me, let me watch them flip the switch on. The heat came on. You could almost hear it blowing. And all of a sudden, it went from comfortable to those two H's, hot and humid. And um, I hung in there. Nicole kept asking, "You okay? You okay?" I said, "Yeah, I feel good. I feel good." And I don't know what mile it was, somewhere in there in that 12, 13, where we stepped into an open field for a while, maybe a mile or so. There was no shade, no protection. And I think that's when the race really zapped me and the heat really impacted me. And it was like it always has been. No warning signs. It just took me down right then and there. Um, the beauty is when that has happened with me in the past, it's been on a flat marathon course or a half marathon course. And even though it gets struggling, there's no additional struggle added to it by the elements outside of the weather. In this case, though, when I started feeling down, there were some climbs that we had to make. And with the trail, there's always the technical piece of the surface you're on with the rocks and the roots. And so that just takes additional energy. It just elevates the heart rate a lot more than maybe it would be just by the heat and humidity alone. And so as I began to climb some of these climbs, literally my breath was taken away and I'm just walking, right? I'm not running even. I'm just walking up these climbs. Um, and it really started to drain on me. Nicole, I won't say she was draining on me, but she was doing what she came there to do. She was trying to make me pull this thing off. And so she, started saying, "Hey, we're going to have to run if we're going to make this cutoff." And at one point she asked me, "Do you want to be out here all day?" And I sort of just shut up. It was, there was friction there in this, in this team. We both knew it. What she didn't know is I was falling fast. There was no motivation that was going to spur me on at that moment. It was a strictly, it wasn't a mind game. And I've said it that I hate to lose to my mind. I hate for my mind and sort of these running devils that I identify because when you're out there running, no matter how far you're going, there's always a running devil that's trying to talk you out of discovering your best self through running. Always. It's always going to be speaking to you. I think the better you're feeling, the louder the voice tries to get. But this wasn't a mental battle. This wasn't the running devil. The running devil was sitting down knowing that the physical side of this thing was taking its toll on me, and the running devil didn't have to open its mouth. And that was true because my body was giving in on me. And I would say at some point there, right around mile 14, 15, I felt as bad as I had ever felt in running, felt as bad as I had ever felt maybe even in anything. It had become a real struggle. And at one point there, I didn't even know, I started wondering, how am I getting off this mountain? Because I'm not walking. The next aid station was mile 18, so it was about 2.5 miles to go to the next aid station. My sport drink was no longer staying down. I couldn't handle it any longer. I'd take a drink of it and just spit it back out. I knew what I was dreaming of, whether I needed it, whether my body was craving it, was just some cold water. So, long story short, my friend Nicole said, "I'll go to the next aid station. I'll run ahead to the next aid station. I'll bring you back some cold water." Now, you can't possibly understand the magnitude of what she was volunteering to do unless you were in the midst of this trail, knew just how far that was when you factor in the climbs and the elements. I didn't understand it at the moment. I just wanted cold water. That's all I could picture. I knew that was the only way I was getting up from where I was and moving on. And so, yes, go, please bring me back some cold water. And so she left. She went on her way. I sat down there on a rock and leaned my head up against a tree for a bit. And at some point, I don't know for how long I was there, but I dozed off, my head against this tree. I woke up and I saw this little red flower, and I thought it was Nicole coming back with the cold water. I said something to the flower, and the flower didn't speak back, and that's when I knew that's not Nicole. And that's when I knew I sort of was seeing things or feeling things that weren't healthy, right? I was just in a bad spot. But I also started to understand what Nicole had taken on, and I wanted to try to cut off her return distance as much as I could. So I forced myself to get up and start walking on. It was sort of a staggering, drunken waddle forward. I ended up covering about a mile, I think, and before she came back, I don't even know how long this was at this point. Maybe an hour, hour and a half. I don't know. But she came back, had this cold water. I drank it, and it wasn't like a miracle drug cure, but it gave me enough to make it to that next aid station 2.5 miles ahead. And again, I don't even know how long that took us, but a while. I was not running. I was not walking fast. I was staggering, but with this water, I felt much better. So we got to the aid station. I knew my day was done at this point, and I was already starting to deal with that, with the disappointment, just the sense of failure that was coming with this. You know, when you dare greatly and then you put it out there and you try to inspire other people to dare greatly with you, to dream bigger than themselves, to take things on that are risky and to overcome the fear that stands in their way of doing that, just really wanting people to experience the beauty that comes, this growth that comes on the other end of risk through success, through accomplishing what you dare greatly to do. When you do this for 5 months, bringing people along with you on the journey, and then you don't pull it off yourself, that is hard to process in the moment of saying, I can't finish this today. It was hard to say to my friend Nicole that I can't go on today. We had partnered on this all along, so she was like the real live person there that represented so many other people in the outside world that I'd tried to bring along on this journey. Saying to her, I can't go on, was a real difficult thing to do. And then to tell the folks at the aid station who were manning the logistics of runners as they came through, keeping track of folks, letting them know that I'm officially out of this thing, that I'll need a ride back to the finish line. That was a tough thing to say, because you're inhaling failure at that point in large doses, along with the water and the food. You're inhaling this idea that my day is done. This dare greatly dream is going to be a dream not come true, and that's a tough deal to start processing, but that's what I started to do. Meanwhile, my friend Nicole, unsurprising to me, she decided, I'm going on. I'm going to go finish this thing. On so many levels, that was just a crazy thing to me. She knew what those next 17-ish miles were. We did them. She knew how hard they were. I couldn't begin to fathom how exhausted she had to be, because she had done those same hot human miles with me, 4 or 5 additional miles to go get me help. all the worry that I know at one point she had to start worrying, is this guy okay, right? How do I get him out of here if he can't get on his own? So that's emotionally draining for her to go through all that to get us to the aid station and then regroup in a way that says, I'm getting refocused, recommitted on finishing this thing I said I was going to do. Floored me, but when I eventually made my way back to the finish line and then went and got a shower, and came back to the finish line then to watch my friend Lori finish up. She finished up a little bit before Nicole. The finish of this Georgia Jewel is sadistic. It's very reflective of the way Jenny Baker and her husband Franklin think. Anybody who would put people through the 35, 50, there's 18-mile, 100-mile journeys out there on this trail, and then think it's a good idea at the very end of this race, in the last half a mile, to have almost a straight uphill climb for several hundred yards, that reflects some fairly sadistic thinking on their part. But from a spectator point, and really from a symbolism point, to be standing at the top of this hill and watch your friends finish off what I know, I couldn't do it, right? I had a hard day. I couldn't pull off what I went there to pull off. And to be standing there watching people come up this final climb to conquering through taking on this adventure that was hard enough in itself. It was just very symbolic for me to watch them finish this thing that way. So I watched Lori come up and pull off what she had set out to do. And then about, 45 minutes, an hour later, I watched Nicole come up and finish off. And for me, watching Lori and Nicole do that, that was really healing for me, because, I think there's a lot of joy to be found in watching other people succeed, in running and just in life in general. When we take things on, it's real easy to get caught up in ourselves. It's really easy to get caught up in our own personal journeys. We get caught up in thinking this is about me, as purposeful as we get to living inside the bigger story, right? I went to Georgia Jewel to run for my friend Kate and Giving Word, and I've shared along the way that there was a bigger sort of outcome to this I wanted in terms of folks supporting Giving Words and Kate. There was also this bigger story to wanting to encourage other people to dare greatly, and started to, put a lot of the success of all of that tied to me finishing the race. But that wasn't the big outcome that was meaningful. Not finishing it did not undo the story. And I was reminded of that when I watched my friends Lori and Nicole finish. I was reminded in this pride I felt in both of them, that, friendships can help us overcome an awful lot. Having pride in others can help us really look at the world in a very right way. To want to pour yourself into others more than you pour into yourself is really an approach to life that I think can make things good when things are going good, and it can make things good when your accomplishments really aren't working out the way you want. It's a great way to get refocused. I'm reminded of every year at the Richmond Marathon when this Megs Miles family, really, that I belong to, is at the finish line pouring themselves into these final runners coming across the finish line. You can just see the joy they have in cheering on others. You can see the pride in their faces. They feel for folks pulling off something that was really difficult for them to do. And so I just think that was a really perfect timing, perfect storm sort of deal for me to be at the top of that hill watching my friends finish. And so that was sort of the end of the Georgia Jewel. I do need to say that, and if my friend Jenny is listening, I didn't deal well with the disappointment there in the beginning. When I got taken back. And ironically, Jenny's husband, Franklin, who is co-race director, he drove me back to the finish line. And, I felt a lot of shame at that finish line. I remember when I got out of the van there, the truck at the finish line, my first thought was get to my car without Jenny seeing me. And she had been so instrumental in getting me to the Georgia Jewel, not in asking me to come, but just in who she is. This beautiful spirit of hers is contagious. And I was drawn to the Georgia Jewel. I wasn't invited to the Georgia Jewel. I was drawn to it by her and just this incredible person that I think she is. And I don't know, somehow that influenced. When I got back to the finish line, my whole idea was hide from Jenny. I don't even want to face her. And I didn't, right? I hid from her. And then even when I watched my friends come back, I hid from Jenny. I was like, I cannot face her. A lot of it was I didn't want to deal with my own emotion in this, and I knew she would bring it out. And so I did not deal well in the end with the disappointment. I'm grateful that I came to another side of that. I came to another side of it because my friend Jenny reached out, after I got back home and sort of called me out on my attitude around failure and not coming to say goodbye to her, and I apologized for that, but there was a lesson in that. We can let disappointment really take us down a negative and dark road. And just like I say, I think there's these running devils that really want us to go down that dark road. There is a life devil too that really wants us to trip up as often as we can and fall into the disappointment that comes with, fall into the negative attitude, I should say, that comes with disappointment. And I did, right? I fell into that. And so I'm sharing this with you so we can all be cautious around getting too wrapped up in these things we want to pull off, to the point that not pulling them off makes us be somebody that is not as good as we want to be. And which is really ironic because we take on these dare greatly things to be the best people that we can possibly be. And for a moment there, I got hauled down the exact opposite outcome I wanted from the Georgia Jewel started to creep in. I started to be a lesser person than I came there to be on the heels of failure. So I'm glad that I sort of was able to go back and be called out in a very loving way by my friend Jenny, who said, this thing was more than a finish line. It was much more than that. And I hope that you'll see that. And I do. And like I said, I followed up, apologized to Jenny, and apologized enough so that I am already dreaming about getting back to Georgia next year. Failure never sits well with me. Unfinished business doesn't sit well with me. Looks like I'll be starting to address unfinished business in January next year in Houston, getting back there and pulling off the Houston Marathon, which I couldn't do. And then it's kind of going to be like a mirror year, right? I said at the beginning of this conversation, Houston was really the spark for me going to Georgia Jewel last year. I'm counting on next year. Redemption at Houston will be the spark that leads me to redemption at the Georgia Jewel next September. So I appreciate you all listening in for this long, looks like about an hour long conversation about my Georgia Jewel experience. Didn't know it would go that long, but like I said, it was a much bigger story than just a day at the races. There was a lot that went on in the background. There's been a lot of life lessons that have come to me through this, and that's really what running has become to me. It's not about the medals. It's just these life lessons that continue to pile up, lessons I love sharing to the degree that they can impact you and help your life. I am really grateful for that. I'm grateful for you coming and listening in today to this conversation, and I hope y'all have a good day. Come back soon. I'll be back to interviewing, not sure who, but I'll have an interview this week that I'll be ready to share with you next week, and we'll get back to the normal format. But today you got just me chatting, me just going on, and sort of, you may be my therapy. I think you're my therapy for processing this whole Georgia Jewel. I thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of that. And you all have a great, great week.